Howdy, and welcome to another Nonsense Wars production. This is Jay. Today, I'll be covering my model of the German DRG Class 24, also known as BR24. I'll talk about the history of the prototype, mechanical aspects of the drivetrain, and some building techniques I used for detailing. The DRG Class 24 was a standard class of German locomotives built in the 1920s and 30s. Designed for light duties on secondary lines, these locomotives had their home in the flat terrain of northern Germany. They served through World War II and continued to serve through the 1970s in East and West Germany. Several also wound up in Poland, where they were known as the OI2 class. I wanted to model this locomotive for two reasons. One, I needed a locomotive to go with my Umbauwagen passenger cars. Two, despite this locomotive's popularity, I hadn't seen a new take on it since Ben Benneke's design from the early 2000s. The time seemed right for a new scale model featuring power functions. I built this model at my usual scale of 1:48, or 15 inches per stud. The finished model is 15 inches long and contains about 700 pieces. The three driving axles mount rigidly to the frame of the locomotive, and the front truck pivots. The model features power functions. A single M motor sits under the cab and powers the center blind driving axle through a 3-to-5 reduction. The connecting rods transfer torque to the front and rear driving axles, just like on the real locomotive. The 3-axle tender has a rigid frame with a sliding center axle to negotiate curves. The tender also houses the power functions, receiver, and battery box, and the body lifts off for access. I mounted the battery box sideways to better take advantage of the shape of the tender on the prototype. You can also easily remove the battery box to change the channel on the power functions receiver. Overall, the locomotive runs and pulls well. You might be thinking that a single M motor doesn't seem strong enough. Like the prototype, this locomotive has a light axle loading, and so lack of adhesion limits pulling power more than a lack of torque does. I've found the pulling power satisfactory, and there's still room inside the boiler for a weight brick if I need more traction. Because this is a 1:48 scale model, I used some special building techniques to capture subtle details. The roof of the cab is 7 studs wide, while the body is 8 studs wide, so the sides of the cab tilt in using hinges. I modeled the smaller Witte smoke deflectors rather than the more common Wagner deflectors because the shape is easier to replicate in Lego. The boiler is 11 plates in diameter to keep the proportions of the prototype. Some of these are based on techniques from Ben Benneke's models. Ben was one of the builders who was active in the early 2000s, and his model of this same locomotive was one of my inspirations when I first started building Lego train mocks. Consider this model an homage to him. Until next time, may you find inspiration wherever you look.